Welcome to Momentous. I am Pastor Rebecca Great, the pastor mission developer for Momentous and the host for our weekly podcast. At Momentous, we believe that God is present with us in each and every single one of our moments. We believe that our stories are connected to God's story and to one another's stories. We believe that this connection and relationship changes our lives and our entire world. Before we begin, I invite you to take a deep breath in, to hold it while you count to 3, and then slowly release that breath. In episode 2, our second full podcast, we learned a bit about how I wrestled with my understanding of being called anywhere, including church camp. And in episode 4, we learned a bit more about the story of how Momentous came to be. But this week, it occurred to me that I hadn't shared the portion of my story that happened before that first summer at church camp and a story that fills in some of the time in between those two stories we've already heard. Now, for me, my call to ministry was a long process, beginning when I was in preschool. And it continues to evolve even as Momentous grows. So to tell this story, we obviously need to back up a few years, back to when all of my grandparents were still living. Back before the household I grew up in attended worship regularly. Back before I knew much about the church, beyond it being that building across the street from my grandparents, where we would go once a week and all of the grandmas of the church would dote on me and my friend Amy as they sewed and tacked quilts together while we played underneath the tables. Now, from spending those days with all of the quilting ladies, I had gotten to know who the pastor of the congregation was, because he regularly made a time to stop by the quilting group to check on them and to get their health updates or the updates of the ones not there. And he always made a point to talk with me and Amy when we could be bothered to stop playing. Now, this portion of the story gets a little fuzzy for me because I don't remember most of this as a true memory. I remember it more as a collection of the memories the grown-ups had remembered for me and then retold to me over and over again. At some point, my grandpa's health became the topic at the quilting group because he had gotten very sick very quickly. And this was in the 1980s when hospital protocols were a little more lax about allowing preschoolers into the intensive care units. So I remember visiting him in the hospital. I remember walking from the hospital to one of my grandpa's friends' houses so she could take care of me while the other older members of the family stayed at the hospital in shifts. Now, eventually, I don't remember if this was hours or days or weeks, but eventually my grandpa did die. Now, that set of grandparents literally lived across the street from the church. If it was a day that ended in the letter Y, there was surely a reason for one or both of them to be at the church. My parents and I had not attended a worship service regularly. I don't even think we attended on Christmas Eve or Easter. But after my grandpa died, we started attending with my grandma every single week. And at that congregation, they celebrated communion during every worship service. Now, I knew the pastor from being at the quilting groups with my grandma and all of her friends, so he wasn't a stranger. And those first few weeks, I apparently threw enormous yelling and stubborn fits when it came time to go up for communion. So I stayed in the pew while my parents went up and then returned. And I wasn't a kid that was really prone to having tantrums. So I think at some point, one of my parents finally asked me what all the fuss was for. And I guess I gave some kind of answer along the lines of, I don't want them to take me too. And it was soon after that, I do remember sitting in the pastor's office. And I guess I explained to the pastor that I saw angels in the church surrounding the altar, and they had been in the hospital with my grandpa, and I wasn't ready to die like he had died. And I wish that I could remember the conversation with any of the grown-ups and with the pastor, but I don't. I was 4. But I do know that after that conversation, I was content to be at church and to go up for communion. And a few weeks later, I told the pastor I want to be a pastor when I grow up so I could help other people not be scared of God too. So now let's flash forward several years to when I am in college. Now, throughout my undergraduate days, I was incredibly active in the Lutheran campus ministry at West Virginia University. So during my senior year, it was time to begin applying to graduate programs. And I had the grades and the teaching experience and all of the extracurriculars and the letters of recommendation and the research experience and the test scores. And my undergraduate thesis was selected to be published in a journal, which is a hard feat when you're in a doctoral program, much less undergrad. To quote The Simpsons, everything was coming up Milhouse. Except there were no acceptance letters. Now, a year or so prior, the chaplain who was serving at the campus ministry at the time asked me if I had ever considered that God might be calling me to seminary. And I promptly laughed in his face in front of everyone who had gathered after worship. He was persistent in explaining all of the options within our denomination at the time, and I would not be moved. No, thank you. Seminary and the ministry were for the actual church nerds. I just liked being there. Thank you very much. Now, there is an entire book of the Bible that is devoted to a prophet named Jonah. And a few weeks ago, I mentioned that Habakkuk is my favorite book in the Bible, and I promise we are going to talk about that book in the future. Jonah is a very close second, partially because of how it parallels my particular call story to being called to be a pastor. But I'm also confident that every single one of us has embodied Jonah at some point in our lives. This is a book that tells us if God's grace is wide enough for everyone we meet in this really short book in the Bible, then God's grace is wide enough for my cranky and resistant to God's call self too. So instead of reading this book to you, I'm going to paraphrase it. Now, I know it's only 4 chapters long. So if you are looking for a book of the Bible to read that is fairly easy to understand and follow along in the plot, this is one of the good ones to start with. Jonah is different from the other Old Testament prophets. Most of the other prophets were in disbelief that God would have chosen them, but they went because they knew God had called them, and so they followed. But this isn't what Jonah did. Jonah flat out ran away, and not just to the next town. Jonah went down to Joppa, which is a city that was a few days' journey away, and then got in a boat and made it all the way to Tarshish, which is near where the Rock of Gibraltar is today. Jonah almost made it to the Atlantic Ocean before a storm came up. A storm that was so terrible that the only possible response was to throw Jonah overboard. And along came a big fish that swallowed Jonah to take him on a 3-day journey that would then spit him out on the beach. And God again told Jonah, "Go to Nineveh." So covered in whale vomit, Jonah begins the long walk back to Nineveh, the place he didn't ever want to go, to deliver a message from God that he didn't want to share with the people who lived in Nineveh, didn't want to share it with the Ninevites. So when Jonah finally arrives, he decides that he is going to fulfill the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, which means he is going to proclaim the exact message that God called him to deliver. But he's not going to put any excitement or urgency into the words he proclaims. If you have ever had to make siblings apologize to one another, you have seen this complete uninterest in saying words that someone else has given you to say. This is the point of this portion of Jonah. But there's more to it if we're going to see ourselves in this story. Because despite Jonah's frustration and apathy, God is at work. The Ninevites repent and turn from all of their evil ways. The entire city proclaimed a fast to turn back from the evil that they had done and were doing. Even the cows in the city wore sackcloth. So great was the Ninevites' repentance. And when God saw this, all of the destruction that was to come to Nineveh was called off, and Jonah is furious about it. And he yells at God, "This is why I fled to Tarshish in the first place. What do you mean you're not going to destroy them? This is Nineveh, for crying out loud. This is the very reason I didn't want to come here, because I knew you would be gracious and merciful and abounding in steadfast love. I knew you didn't really want to punish them." And behind all of this is Jonah's anger and hurt and pain and grief at what the Ninevites had done to his people. These are the same people who came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And after this, they then heavily taxed and dominated the southern kingdom of Israel. And they wrought havoc over all of the present-day Middle East and boasted of how violent they were in their conquests. These people were not an ordinary military power. They were the vilest and cruelest and most inhumane army of the world. So it's no wonder that Jonah didn't want to be there and didn't want there to be any chance of grace and mercy for them. So Jonah, who is furious enough and angry enough that he agrees it would be better for him to die than to live in a world where the Ninevites will be spared, he storms out of the city to wait. And God cares for him by providing a shrub to shade him from the heat. but then also curiously takes the shrub away in the morning. And Jonah is furious again now because it's too hot. So, of course, it's better for him to die than to live. Now, I wasn't quite so dramatic, but my call to ministry in general was my Nineveh. I wanted no part of this call. I tried furiously to work my way into graduate programs, but it didn't happen. So reluctantly, I applied to seminary, and I was granted admission almost instantly. I had bargained with myself that I would go, but I will not ever preach. I decided I would do the bare minimum and become consecrated as a deaconess, not as a pastor. And then I would go to graduate school for psychology and serve the larger church as a psychologist. And this is when I tell you that I learned in my first weekend of classes that preaching was a required class for those becoming pastors and those becoming deaconesses. So then I bargained with myself that I would take the stupid class and I would do enough to pass and I would be done with it. And within that class is when I finally got out of God's way to more faithfully discern what God was doing. I figuratively sat myself down by the tree, just like Jonah, and said, "Okay, God, I'm listening." Now, my call story is important to me because it's my call story. And I know it's not such an unusual story that this is the only way calls can happen. Every single person has a call story, including those who aren't pastors or bishops or deacons or elders. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. And this is a secret I wish more people had told me. But while I was living this portion of my call story, the portion that I've shared in this podcast, it was really difficult to discern whether or not God was calling me to do something, or if my friend was calling me to do something, or if I was just doing something I sort of wanted to and saying that it was God. I was only confident God was present and at work as I looked back on it. Because sometimes the clarity of God's presence comes through hindsight and reflection. And that's okay. I wonder if there are times where you have felt something particular, either in your mind or in your heart or in your gut, tugging you to do something or to not do something. And looking back on it, could that have been God? I'm going to now invite you to take another deep breath to center yourself for prayer. A prayer for discerning hindsight. God, who is always near, if you can send a big fish to scoop Jonah up and spit him up on a beach, it's possible you may be calling for me to do something too. And that makes me want to run. I think I need another reminder. Your voice through a friend's voice, or a storm, or a big fish, to scoop me up and set me on course again. I'm scared, but I know you are right beside me. Amen. Thank you for joining us for our weekly moment to us. We are looking forward to growing with each of you and are so grateful you are part of the Momentous community. Thank you to our mission partners, the Southern Ohio Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Their financial contributions and prayer have been instrumental in bringing this ministry into existence. This week, I will also want to make sure to thank the people at Faith Lutheran Church in Whitehall, which is one of the neighborhoods in Columbus. They've asked me to preach and lead worship with them this morning, and I'll also be leading their adult Sunday school class. Now, they aren't currently live streaming their worship services, but they are on social media, so you can check them out later today. Inviting me to supply preach or to lead an education event or a retreat or to simply be present with you all for worship and to answer questions are additional ways that congregations and ministries can partner with Momentous. And I want to thank everyone who helped us with planning our fall podcast series by answering the question on our Facebook and Instagram stories: what confuses you about God, the Bible, the church, or Christianity? Now, the theme will get announced later this summer, but I will tell you there are clear themes in the responses of things that are weighing on our hearts and minds. I have a big announcement for this week that Momentous is on TikTok. It happened much by accident. I was goofing off editing a video and dropped my phone and clicked post. So we're on TikTok. We will be posting there regularly, and you can find us using the handle @DailyMomentous. However you are engaging with or discerning, partnering with Momentous, we hope that it means you are growing in your faith and noticing God's presence with you. You can always share moments when you notice God's presence by sending us an email at dailymomentous@gmail.com or sending us a direct message on our social media accounts or sending us a voicemail. There are some tips and tricks for how to submit a voicemail located on our website. Every time you interact with us online through social media or sharing a podcast episode, it helps the algorithms know that this is resonating with you, and noticing God's presence is something worth sharing online. Each and every single interaction helps our community reach even more people through your profiles and for how each platform engages with your friends and your followers. As of recording this podcast, our online community has more than 430 people connected and following us across all of the platforms. Now, if you aren't connected to us online, you can find us on your preferred social media platform. Our handle is @DailyMomentous everywhere we are. Now, if you're already connected with us on social media, we would love it if you invited your friends to join our community as well. If you want to support the ministry of Momentous, engaging with us online is one way you can do that. If you are able to give financially, you can visit our website and use the donate link. Each one-time or recurring gift combines together to ensure the Momentous community continues to grow. We give thanks for each and every single one of you, for being a part of the Momentous community and for listening to God's call to try something new, and for beginning to notice God's presence even more frequently in your life, in our communities, and in our world. Until our next podcast, remember to breathe deeply, and that God is present with you every single moment.